Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the National Conference of State Legislatures and the Pew Charitable Trusts for this briefing on savings initiatives in the states. My name is Anna Petrini, and I'm a policy specialist in the Strategic Initiatives Department at the National Conference of State Legislatures. I'll be serving as the moderator of today's webinar. As a reminder, if at any time during this webinar you have any difficulty hearing the audio through your computer speakers, please use your telephone to dial in to hear the audio portion. The National Conference of State Legislatures is pleased to partner with the Pew Charitable Trust to bring you this webinar. In case you are not familiar with NCSL, we are a bipartisan organization that serves the legislators and staffs of the nation's 50 states, its commonwealths, and territories. NCSL provides a number of different services, including research, testimony, and opportunities for lawmakers to exchange ideas on pressing state policy issues. The subject of consumer savings falls within the jurisdiction of two NCSL standing committees, Budgets and Revenue Committee and the Labor and Economic Development Committee. These standing committees provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, as well as a framework for legislators to create formal public policy positions for NCSL. The committees meet twice a year at the NCSL Legislative Summit and the NCSL Capitol Forum. For more information on these meetings or NCSL's activities and services to legislators and legislative staff, please visit our website at www.ncsl.org. Next slide, please. The purpose of this jointly sponsored webinar is to examine state efforts to help families prepare for their financial needs. Saving money isn't easy. Many Americans report that they have trouble saving because of unexpected expenses and strains on their budgets. This, coupled with the fact that more than a third of Americans lack access to an employer-sponsored retirement system, means financial hurdles when retirement comes around. We will learn what makes saving so difficult and hear about new strategies states are trying out that may help more families prepare for their future financial needs. Today's webinar features four presenters. After we hear from our panelists, we will open up the discussion to include questions from the audience. To ask questions, you can simply type a question in the Q&A box in the right-hand corner of your screen. Your question will not be visible to everyone, only to the webinar administrators. We will take as many questions as possible within the time we have available. Next slide, please. Our first speaker, Clinton Key, is the Research Officer for Savings and Financial Security at the Pew Charitable Trust. The project conducts original research that explores when, how, and how much American households save, examines how savings are used for financial security, and evaluates the potential of programs and policies to improve the financial situation of Americans. Mr. Key holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago and a master's degree from the University of North Carolina. Next slide, please. Our second presenter will be John Scott, who directs the Retirement Savings Project at the Pew Charitable Trust. The project conducts original research and works with experts and policymakers to understand what barriers to retirement savings exist in the United States, how specific policy initiatives might increase retirement savings, and whether strengthening the disclosure of fees can help employers and employees make better decisions about their retirement plans. Dr. Scott holds a doctorate in sociology from Cornell University, a master's degree in sociology from the University of Maryland, a law degree from Penn State, and a bachelor's degree in economics from Swarthmore College. Next slide. Next, we'll hear from Ruth Holton-Hodson, Senior Policy Advisor on Health and Retirement Initiatives for the California State Treasurer. She has spent her 30-year career as a consumer advocate in the nonprofit, philanthropic, and government sectors. In the past, she has served as the Deputy Controller for Health and Consumer Policy, worked for the California Wellness Foundation focusing on increasing access to health care in low-income communities, was an advocate and then Executive Director for the California Common Cause, and was a lobbyist for the California Children's Lobby. Ms. Holton-Hodson has an MA in Educational Administration from the University of Chicago. Next slide. Finally, we'll hear from Utah Senator Todd Weiler, who has been a state senator since 2012. Senator Weiler grew up in the suburbs of Chicago and moved to Utah for college. He holds a business degree from Brigham Young University and a JD from the J. Reuben Clark School of Law. He is married with 4 children and practices law as a profession. Senator Weiler served as the co-chair of a year-long NCSL Foundation partnership that explored retirement security issues. We look forward to hearing from all of our distinguished speakers and thank them all for agreeing to participate in this session today. Now I'm going to turn the program over to Clint Key. Welcome, Clint.
Thanks, Anna, and thank you also to everyone tuned in. The Pew Charitable Trust is an independent, nonprofit organization driven by the power of knowledge to solve today's most challenging problems. I'm excited to share Pew's latest thinking about the challenges and opportunities faced by American families as they prepare for short and long-term needs. Increasingly, here in Washington and around the country, in the media and in the policy community, financial insecurity is being treated as one of the most pressing problems facing America today. Pew has 2 teams engaged on this crucial issue. The Retirement Savings Project studies the challenges and opportunities for increasing retirement savings. You'll hear from their director, John Scott, in a few minutes. And I work for Pew's Financial Security and Mobility Project. We examine how savings, income, and consumption relate to the financial well-being of households in the short term and the longer term economic mobility. When it comes to savings, the status quo just isn't working for American families. Here are some figures from Pew's nationally representative Survey of American Family Finances that bear this out. People just don't feel financially secure. They don't feel like they have slack between their income and their expenses. They say that they want to save, but that unexpected expenses get in their way. And at the end of the day, about a third of people say that they have no money at all that they think of as savings. It's important to note this isn't just lower income folks. We see these things at every income level and across all demographic groups. And I also want to be clear that these measures are about perception. People feeling that things aren't going well, that financially people aren't where they want to be for themselves and their families. I've spent most of my time so far this year listening to people talk about their finances, where they are today and where they want to go. Everyone tells us that they want more money in their accounts, don't we all? But what they tell us they really want is the security and peace of mind that money buys them. Not having to worry so much, not losing sleep over financial worries at the end of the month. The great thing about Pew's survey data is that in addition to how people feel, we also see where they are in terms of dollars and cents and how that might translate into financial well-being. We dive into our data to ask, how vulnerable are families today? Are people prepared to weather their next financial storm? We know from our data and from life that unexpected expenses, medical bills, car or home repairs, and things like that, or someone bringing in less income than expected, are really common. More than half of households have major expenses like these each year. And for a typical household, their most expensive unexpected expense in a year will cost them about $2,000. So if something like that happened, could people deal with it? For this analysis, we measure savings 2 ways. We asked people, what is the most money they think they could come up with in 30 days? They could include cash on hand, credit, borrowing from friends or family, anything that a person thinks they'd be able to use. Though most people tell us that in an emergency, they'd turn first to their savings, and if that weren't available, to their credit card. We call this perceived emergency savings. Next, we ask at the time of the survey how much people have in their checking accounts and their savings accounts, on prepaid cards, and in cash stored at home. We add all these together and we call this people's liquid savings. We find that most people, but certainly not all, have the cash on hand to pay for a $2,000 expense. But I want to be really clear. This isn't saying that most people could afford it, just that they'd be able to pay that expense at all. Also, the later in the month we interviewed someone, the less likely it was that they thought that they could come up with at least $2,000 or that they had $2,000 in their accounts. Now, in addition to unexpected expenses, many folks we speak with express worry about losing a job, about how they'd make ends meet if one day their income just stopped coming in. The bulk of the expenses that most people have, housing, healthcare, payments on credit cards or on cars, aren't something that people can reduce really quickly if suddenly income were to go away. And to get a sense of how people would fare if their income did stop, we compare family savings to their monthly income. We looked at whether people's savings could replace 1 month of their income, and most people could not. The typical lower income household, making less than $25,000 a year, only has liquid savings to replace 6 days of their income. And those making between $50,000 and $85,000 a year, above the median income in the U.S. today, are doing better, but the typical household in that group could only replace 29 days of their income. They wouldn't be able to last an entire month. In these data, we see a clear reason that so many households tell us that they don't feel financially secure. Few households have the resources to buffer them when things go wrong, and many households are one bad day away from severe financial trouble, and they know it. I'm going to pass it to John in just a second, but I want to leave you with one last detail from our survey. we asked people if for their family they would rather have financial stability or would rather have economic mobility. It was shocking to us. 92% of our respondents told us they would rather have financial stability. That's a really modest want, but it's something that for too many people feels out of reach today. I'm going to pass it to John now to tell you about retirement savings.
Thanks, excuse me. Thanks, Clint. And let me sort of shift the focus now to more long-term savings and talk a little bit about why retirement savings is important. Number one is longevity. We're living longer, and while labor force participation is picking up among older Americans, we can still largely expect to have longer periods of time in retirement that we're going to have to fund. The second point is that retirement can be costly, separate and apart from the everyday expenses of consumption. For example, long-term care is very costly, and as you can see from the slide, a skilled nursing facility averages about $80,000 a year. Most workers are in savings programs, not in traditional pensions that promise a benefit at retirement. So they have to make a lot of decisions, such as how much to save, how to invest their funds, how much to take out when they do retire. And the evidence on savings levels is not great. You can see that the median retirement savings account for a household that's aged between ages 55 and 64 is approximately $76,000. So when we look at this from a national or macro level perspective, we see a discouraging picture. Across all American households today, some have estimated a total savings shortfall of $4.1 trillion. Another study estimated that just over half of American households will suffer a decline in their standard of living in retirement. Many Americans in old age are already carrying debt. You can see the statistic there on the so-called silent generation, and we expect that successive generations will have even more debt. And people often have to spend down their assets to deal with health shocks or other financial expenses that would not be covered by Medicare or Social Security. So the key to a solution is understanding who has access to a retirement savings plan and who is participating. This map shows some results of analysis the Pew has done looking at retirement plan access and participation in workplace retirement plans across the whole country. Darker colors indicate higher rates of access to a retirement savings plan, and you can see clear regional differences. The upper Midwest, New England, and the Pacific Northwest have much higher rates of access, and the South and West, in general, have lower rates of access. Now let's look at a summarized picture of the range in access in participation. As you can see in the graph, workers in Florida have the lowest rate of access to a retirement plan at 46%, and that's just full-time, full-year workers. The highest rate was among workers in Wisconsin at 70%, although that still means that more than 400,000 full-time, full-year workers in Wisconsin lack access to a retirement plan. The same two states have the lowest and highest participation rates at 38% and 61% respectively. This graph shows the take-up range across the states. And when I say take-up, we're talking about just those workers who have a retirement plan at their workplace. Participation, which I mentioned before, is for all workers regardless of access. So as you can see, it's much higher than we saw with the participation rates. That is, when workers have an opportunity to save, they generally take advantage of it. But the take-up rate is not entirely consistent across the states, ranging from 76% in Nevada to 90% in Indiana. So the lower take-up rates in some states suggest that it might be worth trying to identify and remove obstacles to participation among some workers who do have access to a plan. But a key takeaway from all of this is that the policy focus should be on providing access to retirement savings, because the vast majority of workers will participate if given a chance. So what might explain some of the patterns that we see? Based on previous research, we know that various employer and individual characteristics can play a role in retirement plan access and participation. Two employer characteristics are important. One is employer size, and specifically, we know that smaller firms are less likely to offer a retirement plan to their workers. And the other characteristic is industry. We know that certain industries, such as construction and leisure and hospitality industries, are less likely to offer retirement plans to their workers. But there are also individual characteristics that seem to matter as well. Lower income workers have less access, younger workers, such as the millennials, those who haven't achieved as much in terms of educational attainment, as well as communities of color and Hispanics also have less access and lower rates of participation. And all these characteristics vary across the states for a variety of reasons. Now, just focusing on workers who have access to a plan, we do find a couple of specific reasons that might be inhibiting participation. One has to do with plan rules, such as requiring a minimum number of hours to participate. For example, you might have to work 1,000 hours in a year in order to join the retirement plan. Those kinds of rules may effectively prevent participation in these plans. So for example, almost 3/4 of part-time workers who do not participate say they were ineligible to do so. This suggests that the 36% of part-time workers who are ineligible for a plan that their employer provides may effectively be the same as workers who do not have any plan at all. Affordability. Affordability was the top concern among full-time workers. 44% of those who did not participate cited affordability issues. Some workers may feel that they have too little disposable income to contribute to a retirement plan or to deal with short-term financial needs, while others may be saving their money for other purposes, such as buying a house. So just some quick implications of this is that retirement savings is not retirement security, but it is important to achieving retirement security. Workers will participate when given a chance, so the access or providing access to workplace retirement plans can make a great deal of difference. And the policy focus in providing that access and trying to boost participation has to be on small employers, certain industries, younger people, low-income households, and underserved communities. Now, in thinking about the policy response, at the federal level, we haven't seen any major legislation pass in the 10 years since the 2006 Pension Protection Act, although there have been a number of proposals, and there are a number of proposals out there. But the point is that we've seen a lot of policy activity at the state level. For example, in more than half the states, legislators have made various policy initiatives that would boost retirement savings for private sector workers. And Pew has sort of summarized these approaches into 3 basic avenues towards boosting retirement savings for private sector workers. In one approach, states sponsor a retirement plan just like a private sector employer would. For example, Massachusetts has passed a law allowing small nonprofits to participate in a single group contributory retirement plan that the state treasurer's office would oversee. A second approach is automatically enrolling workers into an individual savings program. For example, 5 states are rolling out a payroll deduction savings program under which workers without a workplace plan would save into individual retirement accounts, or IRAs. And one of our speakers, Ruth Holton-Hodson, will talk about that particular approach from the California experience. And then finally, states can help or encourage employers to start plans for their own workers. Washington State and New Jersey are intending to create marketplace exchanges to help small businesses and the self-employed to shop for retirement plans. Now, at this point, let me just stop and shift this back over to Clint to talk about some of the interactions between short-term and long-term savings. Clint?
Thanks, John. As I've mentioned, we've recently been all over the country talking with people about their money. And we talked to a few folks for whom the current set of short-term and retirement savings options are working really well. Think about the perfect user. They know what their various needs are now and what they will be in the future, and they allocate their money among them, and they mostly get it right. Money gets put into buckets for different needs using different types of accounts, 401ks, 529s, CDs, savings accounts, and the streams of those accounts don't tend to cross, and that's how the products and the policies are designed to work. There are many, though, for whom the status quo isn't working either for the short term or the long term. Our data show that the reality often overcomes policy and product design. Some people will use products as they're intended, others will bend them in unexpected directions, and for many it will end up pretty complicated and really, really messy. We ask if there are avenues to design products that align with the way people think about their own money and with people's goals and needs. We start where the money starts for most people, with their employer delivered through payroll systems, increasingly through direct deposit. In the current environment, a person could engineer the solution for themselves, but we see challenges on both sides. We see people who don't save enough in the short run and end up leaking money from their retirement accounts for short-term needs. We also see people not starting to save for retirement because they don't feel confident enough to be locked away from their money. The default, and defaults are incredibly powerful influences on people's behavior, is that some money is locked away and the rest goes into an account designed for spending. The burden of saving falls onto the individual, and doubly so where the workplace doesn't offer retirement savings options. Our data offers some pointers at what people want and need to build savings. First, automaticity works. We see how automatic savings builds balances for retirement for the workers who have access to such programs. And this logic should hold for short-term savings as well. Next, people need help managing the ebbs and flows of their finances, knowing when times are good and when times are tough and what to do in those situations. And to manage, they need to be able to access their money quickly and easily in an emergency. The sidecar account model builds from these insights. Sidecar is a savings account for short-term needs that operates in tandem with newer existing retirement savings programs. Money automatically goes into the sidecar and into retirement from each paycheck until the sidecar hits some threshold. Then all of the money flows into a retirement account. Whenever a person wants, they can initiate a transfer into checking or another transaction account. But the default is savings, building a cushion for the unexpected. In addition, and this is important, sidecar preserves individual choice and the person's control over their own money. While sidecar has not yet been rigorously tested, each element shows promise for building short-term savings and financial well-being and for removing barriers to retirement savings participation. There are also still regulatory and technical questions about the model that Pew is exploring. The data show that Americans are struggling financially even as the economy improves, and innovative new models like sidecar savings can help families to feel and to be more financially secure today, in the short term, and make plans for the long term. John has a few more thoughts on sidecar, and then we'll pass it on to the others. John?
Yeah, Clint, and really just one thought, and I really like your point about how savings, we often put them into silos, and it's really important to sort of get beyond that silo-based thinking. Short-term and long-term savings does not have to be a zero-sum game, and in fact, they can be quite complementary to each other. And it sort of gets to this point about affordability that I made earlier, and it sort of draws upon my experience when I've talked to retirement plan participants in doing some work before Pew. People want to know before they put money away for the long term, can they access it if they really need it? And I think, the kinds of tools that we're talking about here, that Clint mentioned the sidecar, these could be really revolutionary in terms of not just providing some security for short-term shocks, but also encouraging people to put more money away for the long term because they have that security in the short term. So with that, I'll just stop and we'll now go to Ruth Holton-Hodson. Ruth?
Great, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Next slide. I'm delighted to talk about what is secure choice. As John described, in California, we are in fact just starting our Secure Choice program. It's a voluntary workplace retirement savings plan. It will enable employees to automatically contribute with the choice of opting out into their personal IRA account, and will be managed by the Secure Choice Retirement Savings Investment Board. Since we're only really at the very beginning stages, what I thought I would do is to sort of talk a little bit about the problem that we're facing here in California, sort of a brief history of Secure Choice, the key elements of the program, and how we plan to proceed. Next slide, please. So in California, as you know, we're an enormous state, and we have 7.5 million Californians who work for employers who do not offer a retirement plan. Of those, 2/3 are workers of color, almost half of which are Latinos, and almost 4 million are women. Next slide, please. So let me tell you a little bit about the history of secured choice. This has been a long journey. In fact, Senator De Leon, who carried both the implementing legislation and the foundational legislation, really started working on this in 2008. But he was finally able to get a bill passed in 2012, SB 1234 and SB 923, which sort of provided the basic framework. It established a 9-member board and required a market analysis and legal analysis and feasibility study before the legislature could consider implementation. What was important about this is that it also laid out that the plan could not be considered, could not put employers under ERISA, and it must be designed to maximize participation, minimize fees and costs, and provide a portable benefit. There were no appropriations, so we had to raise the money entirely from foundations for the studies, and we're very grateful to Pew for being one of the contributors to that, and we were able, over about a 2-year period, to secure $1 million for the study. So we began the study process in 2015. Next slide, please. So the market analysis found that we would, in fact, be able to provide a retirement savings plan for 6.8 million workers, and that represents 55% of the private sector workers age 18 to 64 who don't currently have access to a workplace retirement plan. I think a really important thing to focus on is almost 60% are under the age of 40, which we all know is really a critical time for people to start saving so that they really, in fact, can maximize the amount of savings they're able to accrue by the time they need to retire. 2/3 are workers of color, and over half are male and slightly less than half are females. Next slide, please. Some of the job-related characteristics, as has been mentioned before, this is really targeted to low and moderate wage workers. The median wage in this case is $23,000, which is really not a lot of money when it comes to living in the state of California. 54% work in firms with less than 100 workers. 83% of workers are full-time. And not surprising, nearly half of the eligible workforce is in hospitality, retail, healthcare, and social services. Next slide. The survey and focus group results were very interesting, and we were frankly very pleased by them. First, we found that most uncovered workers in California, even those who are considered low income, want to save for retirement, and most importantly, they feel they could save at least a small amount. And as most recent studies have shown, workers value payroll deduction as really the easiest way to save. A particularly important finding for how we move forward is that eligible participants are equally comfortable with a 3% or 5% contribution rate, and they are also likely to be comfortable with the auto escalation in 1% increments. We also found that the likely participation rates are certainly sufficiently high to enable the program to achieve financial viability. So let me talk a little bit, next slide please. Let me talk a little bit about our feasibility study as other states are thinking about doing this plan. First of all, as I said, the program was found to be financially viable and self-sustaining even under adverse conditions. What was most interesting is because of the large scale of the program, 6.8 million workers, even an extreme opt-out rate of 80% doesn't materially affect the program. What does materially affect the program is it's highly sensitive to contribution rates. So going back to the previous slide, when people are really don't mind whether it's a 3 to a 5%, obviously I think we're going to really want, with this finding, it makes us comfortable seriously considering a 5% contribution rate. The other thing that the feasibility study found, and our statute calls for, is that the fees can't be more than 1%. And we were certainly pleased to find that the fees will decline significantly after the first 5 years of operation. And not surprisingly, because our college savings 529 savings plan began at fees about 1%, and they have dropped 5 times now, and they're now 0.03%. So we really anticipate, given the volume of participation, even if it's a somewhat low volume, say, as I said, 80% opt-out, we still have 1.3 million participants, that our fees are going to be very attractive. Next slide, please. So let me talk a little bit about the key provisions, and these provisions really are not dissimilar from the other states that are in the process of adopting secure choice-like programs. This applies to employers with 5 or more employees, but we'll be phasing it in over 3 years. So when we begin the program, employers of 100 or more will have 12 months within which to participate. I think what's really important to state here is that employers will not be required to enroll their employees in secure choice. The mandate is that employers that do not provide a retirement plan for their employers will have to provide access to secure choice. So what we're saying to employers is, you know, you're more than welcome, and in fact we would encourage you to seek out better retirement plans. But if you do not provide a retirement plan, then your workers, then you need to enroll your workers in secure choice. We also provide multiple employer safeguards. There's no liability for an employee's decision to participate in the program. Employers would not be a fiduciary. They're not responsible for or liable for the administration of the program or investments. And employers would not be able to contribute to the employee account. Next slide, please. So for the employees will be automatically enrolled, but again could choose to opt out. And as I said, the statute says that the contribution rate will be between 2% to 5%. So that's really up to the board. We'll make that determination. Employers can, the rate will automatically be increased by 1% annually up to 8%, but employees can choose a lower rate. So for the first 3 years of the program, the managed accounts would be invested in U.S. Treasuries or similarly low-risk investments. This was really more due to a compromise than any specific policy goal. As I said, employees would pay a small fee, and then those who opt out can elect to participate again during specific enrollment processes. And hardship withdrawals are permitted. Again, this is going to be something that the board determines. Our key supporters and opponents, the key advocates of this program, AARP, Small Business Majority, National Council of La Raza, Young Invincibles, and SEIU, are really the key supporters, have been working on this throughout the country. I think besides the usual suspects, what is really important if you want to advance this legislation in your state is really winning the support of small business chambers and business associations. In our case, we got a lot of support from small business chambers, and especially ethnic chambers. And you know, they don't have the administrative capacity, they don't have the HR capacity. You know, we have millions of small ethnic business folks who really don't know how to really interact with the financial sector, let alone being able to pick out, okay, what's a good retirement plan for my employees. So over 75% of small businesses and 900 small businesses that were surveyed here in California said that they actually thought a secure choice type plan would make them more competitive because they would be able to then offer employees an ability to save for retirement. And so they, I think, really in California were just a key for us to be able to get this bill through the finish line. The opponents were the financial services industry, not surprisingly, and a group called Investment Company Institute, ICI, that's been working very hard in states across the country and now in Congress to kill secure choice type programs. We were delighted to be able to get the California Chamber of Commerce and the California Manufacturers Association to go neutral. And they really, in fact, went neutral once we had multiple employer protections written into the bill, and most importantly, once the Department of Labor guidelines were adopted that made it very clear that employers that were mandated to participate in secure choice-like programs would not be subject to ERISA. Next slide, please. So the operations. Our operational model has not yet been adopted by the board, but staff is sort of anticipating that we will get support for the model that we're proposing and that I'm about to outline here. Like the 529 plans, it will be a state agency, and the plan itself will be administered by a private sector financial firm chosen by the board, and the operations will be overseen by the 9-member Secure Choice Board. We'll work very closely with the California Employment Development Department, EDD, as they are the only state agency that has contact with all employers in the state of California. And so they will be the ones that provide the information that our board will develop to employers about the program. The employers only have 2 administrative roles. First, they have to provide the information about the program to their employees, and then they have to set up the automatic payroll contributions with the record keeper. And that's it. From then on, it's actually, in fact, the record keeper that has the relationship with the employee. It's the record keeper that would have the responsibility to verify account holder identity, notify employees of the opt-out process. It's going to be the record keeper that answers all the questions about the individual account, contribution elections, refunds, etc. Next slide, please. So our implementation timeline, we're thrilled. We just hired an executive director, so we're really thrilled about that and eager to move forward. At this last meeting, just on Monday, the board approved the RFP for a consultant to really assist us with the regulation process and to develop the RFPs for the record keepers and investment managers. We have also sort of started figuring out what's the best process to engage stakeholders. We worked very closely with stakeholders during the legislative process, and we intend to continue to do so. We are going to be we've actually started to set up informal advisory committees, one for business and one for employee representatives, to really work with us very closely as we go through the regulatory process. And then, by the fall or winter of 2017-18, we hope to have identified the investment consulting, the program managers, and start developing the employer packets. Next slide, please. Our goal is to open the program up for business to the first tranche of employers who have 500 or more employees by the end of 2018. So that's what we're working towards. So some of the key program issues, as I said, we were actually very fortunate. We kept the legislation as broad as possible in order to make sure that the legislature didn't get into too much detail. It's because, this is really a moving target, much better for the board to make decisions on what the investments will be, etc. So some of the key issues, we have to determine the contribution levels. The statute allows us to go from anywhere from 2% to 5%. It also allows for auto escalation up to 8%. So determining what that is important. Determining the hardship criteria, that's going to be quite a debate, I'm sure. And so we expect to spend a lot of time on that. Obviously, we have to define our investment policy, so we'll be spending a lot of time on that. We have an interesting quirk in this legislation that needs to be resolved. While we do say we are automatic enrollment with opt-out, we have statutory language in one place that permits automatic enrollment, and in another place it actually requires that employees acknowledge that neither the employer nor the state have liability for their decisions and for the investment returns in the program. So the question is, does that mean does someone who does not acknowledge that, could they be automatically enrolled in the program? And so that's something that we're going to have to resolve. Obviously, we have to design, and we are in the process of designing effective employer outreach and education programs and also employee outreach and education programs. We also in the state of California have a very interesting other element in our statute, and that is the requirement to really explore, can we enable the participation of in-home supportive service workers? They sort of fall in a very interesting part in the law where they're not really private employees, but they're not really public employees. But we really want to be able to figure out how we might allow IHSS workers to participate in the program. And so with that, I will turn it over to Senator Weiler, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. I have been a member of the Utah State Senate since 2012, and in 2014, in the fall of 2014, I began working with our state treasurer, Richard Ellis. He has since moved on, but on this issue, and I was gearing up to run a bill in our 2015 general session, which begins in January and just runs for 45 days, on creating a retirement, savings plan in Utah. Utah, of course, is very different than California. We're a much smaller state. We only have about 3.1 million people in the entire state. We're also a red state, which means that, and I'm not trying to be overly partisan, but there's certain types of bills that would be frowned upon and would likely not be supported by a Republican majority legislature. About 84% of both of our state House and state Senate is Republican, with the other 16% being Democrat. So I was looking at developing a plan in Utah that, number one, would not make the state subject to any ERISA liability, and number two, would not impose any sort of mandate on the employer and on the employee. And I did that fully cognizant of the fact that these programs are much more successful, at least the data shows they would be more successful if there is an auto enrollment with the opportunity to opt out. But I didn't feel like there would be the legislative will to pass that type of mandate on to the employee or to the employer to mandate employer participation. So as we were gearing up to run a bill in the 2015 session, in December, about a month and a half before the session began, we decided to pull back, and that was because we were hearing rumblings that that there was going to be a new federal rule from the Department of Labor, and we didn't want to get ahead of the rule. And so rather than running a bill in 2015, I ran a resolution, which is really just a message. It doesn't have the teeth or the force of law. And I was able to pass a resolution almost unanimously. It was Senate Joint Resolution 9, or SJR 9. And the resolution outlined and framed the issue, so we use it as an educational term, educational device, and that also it urged Utah workers and business communities to join with the legislature to study and develop a model for saving for retirement through the small business workplace that's accessible to the workers of Utah, and consider legislation if needed to put the plan into action. And I'm going to give you some of the highlights of the resolution, but after we passed this resolution, the state treasurer and I invited about 30 businesses to join us in a kind of an informal work group and task force, and we met several times once a month for about 6 months throughout the summer and the fall of 2015, and went through a lot of data. We actually even held a town hall and did a lot to prepare to run a bill in 2016, which I eventually did. Just some highlights of the resolution. We highlighted that millions of people are facing the risk of running out of savings after they retire, that self-sufficient retirement is no longer a reality. More than 55 million Americans do not have a way to save for their retirement work, leaving them more likely to rely on Social Security as their only source of retirement income. The average annual Social Security benefit in Utah is $15,100 a year, and there are about a little over a quarter million Utah residents who received Social Security in 2012. The census data showed us that in Utah, about 7% or 19,924 older Utahns were living in poverty and without Social Security income. An additional 35% of older Utahns, or 95,000 people, would fall into poverty. Utah's low and middle income older adults were even more reliant on Social Security benefits, as they typically received about 72% of their family income from Social Security. Incidentally, I ran a bill in 2015 to remove the state income tax off of Social Security benefits, and that failed. Utah is one of about 15 states that taxes Social Security income, even though it really constitutes a double taxation, because you pay tax on your gross income before you pay into Social Security, and then we in 14 other states are then, when you get the money back out of Social Security, we're taxing it a second time, which I think is patently unfair, especially to the poor. And so those are some of the highlights, and it went through a number of statistics, and I don't want to go into all of those, but that's actually, well, if you go to the next slide, I'm sorry, that's the resolution, and I know it's probably too small for you to read. Let's go to the next slide. That should be the end of the resolution. And then the next slide will be my 2016 legislation. So in 2016, I was prepared and geared up to run a bill, and had all the hope and optimism in the world. And so the bill, and you can see this kind of smaller on the slide, the bill that I ran in 2016 session, and we are a part-time legislature, so we have a 45-day session each winter, and then we're done usually by the second week of March. But I ran Senate Bill 133. I made some substitutions along the way. I've provided an incentive in the form of a small tax credit for employers to open that valve and start providing these payroll deduction type of retirement plan benefits. And the number one goal that I had in everything I've done is to just increase the number of employees who have the opportunity to participate in a payroll deduction retirement savings plan at work. And we know in Utah, and I think the same as nationally, about 52.6% of the private sector employees do not have that option available to them at work, and many of them work for small businesses. And we also know that people are at least 7 and maybe as high as 15 times more likely to save for their own retirement if they can simply do it through a payroll deduction at work. And so I drafted this bill, and we went through the legislative grinder, and I'm in the Senate. I was able to pass this bill through a Senate Retirement Committee, and then through the Senate floor almost unanimously. It may be out of 29 senators, I think it had maybe 3 or 4 opposing votes. When I got to the House, it was heavily lobbied against by the financial services industry, and I wasn't present during all of those sidebar conversations. But many of my colleagues in the Utah legislature who served in the House, they were coming to me with questions like, so I hear you're trying to start Utah's own Social Security system. And I'd say, no, this is nothing like that. But several of those comments made me believe that that's the type of lobbying effort that, the whisper campaign that that went against this in the Utah House of Representatives. And so this went to the House Rev and Tax Committee. We have a House Retirement Committee that I think should have heard this bill, because typically a bill like this would go to the Retirement Committee. It was sent to the Rev and Tax Committee, I believe, because the lobbyists got people on the Rules Committee to send it to a tougher committee, and it did die in that committee. And some of the arguments I was hearing against it was, this is not the proper role of government. People can choose to save for the retirement if they want to, but it's not the government's role to necessarily incentivize them for that. And I was really surprised, because some of the members of the financial services industry who had served on the task force with me the year before were actually, the same people testifying against the bill and lobbying against the bill. So that bill, Senate Bill 133 in 2016 session, it died. And so I reintroduced a bill, if you want to go to the next slide, and then the next slide after that, I think. I introduced a bill this year, which is Senate Bill 109. So can we advance the slides? One more. Okay, one more. So this is all the bill that died. So Senate Bill 109, keep going. There. So Senate Bill 109, I presented this year, and there was a lot of involvement from the state treasurer. And by the way, our state treasurer changed in 2015, and it's now David Damchen. I originally worked with Richard Ellis, and he left and took another job, and both of them were great to work with. So this, the 2017 version, it was less reliant on the treasurer's office. That was some of the talking points against the bill, was that there was too much government control and whatnot. And it was going to set up a committee kind of oversee. And the idea would be that you would choose I originally started off that you could choose one or more plans that was approved by the Treasurer's Office. That was 2016. That was controversial, so I amended it and said that you could choose any plan as long as it was ERISA compliant and it had a payroll deduction option at work. And you could choose any plan to get the tax credit. But my main objectives in this regard was, number one, we wanted to make it easy for a small business owner, and the idea of the state pre-vetting some of those plans and giving their stamp of approval was very attractive. I called that the easy button. And number two, we wanted to get their attention, because when we did our town hall and the work group, we kept on hearing the same issue from small business owners, and that's that they're so busy that they just don't have time to stop and focus on something like this. And when they do stop and focus on it, they're just overwhelmed with the number of plans out there, and they don't feel qualified to evaluate them. So I made some cosmetic changes to Senate Bill 109. It went to the same Senate Retirement Committee, and it was held there. I didn't have enough votes this year to even get it out of Senate Committee, and then I dramatically watered down the bill, Senate Bill 109 this year, and I was able to pass the watered down version through the House and the Senate. So we do have a tax credit in place that would offer, it's only $500 non-refundable tax credit to the employer who, and we had to limit the employers from 10 to 20 employees, whereas the 2016 bill would have been up to 100 employees. So it's basically a pilot program. It's only a $500 tax credit. The advantages of this bill is all of the salesmen that are already out there and all of the plans already out there, they can send notices and say, if you sign up for a plan at work this year, you can qualify for a tax credit. It is a one-year pilot basis, but unfortunately, to get the bill passed and to get the lobbyists to stand down, I had to take out all of the screening process. That's what what they found most objectionable. The lobbyists for the financial service industry, they didn't want the state putting its thumb on the scale and saying this plan's okay, but this plan is not okay. And so we do have a pilot program, and even with this watered down version of the pilot program, I got a call from our governor last week with questions about the bill. So our session ended on March 9th. Our governor has 20 days to either sign a bill or veto it. And I'm happy to say that the bill was not vetoed, but the governor also chose not to sign it, which is his prerogative. So the pilot program is going to effect, but the governor did not sign it, so it still goes into law. So I'm a little bit discouraged with the opposition I faced, but we did get something passed, and we'll have some data to look at in a year or year and a half to move forward. So that will conclude my presentation.
Thank you very much, Senator. Now that we've heard from all of our presenters, we're happy to take questions. Again, to ask a question, please type your question in the Q&A box in the right-hand corner of your screen. As we're waiting for your questions, I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the NCSL website. We have one question incoming about federal legislative developments. Are you aware of the Department of Labor rules that allow retirement savings for private sector workers in cities and states? The regs related to cities were overturned today by the Senate. Perhaps, John, Scott, if you're still with us, you can give a little bit of an overview of what's going on at the federal congressional level.
Sure. Thanks, Anna. Yes, we are aware of these DOL rules. They're basically, just as background, there are two rules or guidance issuances that came out of the Department of Labor last year. One was for states and one was for political subdivisions, aka cities. And basically what the guidance, in both cases, what the guidance was trying to do was clarify whether these state or city auto IRA programs, like the ones that Ruth was talking about for California, whether they would be subject to ERISA, and what were sort of the guideposts for states to sort of operate a payroll deduction IRA program that used automatic enrollment, like Secure Choice. And so basically what's happening legislatively is that there's a federal law known as the Congressional Review Act that is designed to essentially rescind guidance that comes out of the administration towards the end of their term. And there are two resolutions that have been introduced in the House and the Senate that each would rescind the city and state guidance. And so there was a vote today, and that was approved, so that the guidance for the cities has been rescinded. It's not clear whether the guidance for the states will be brought up for a vote in the Senate. That's not clear as of this writing. And so really, I guess what the question is, whether or not the state guidance is revoked is what happens going forward. And the answer is a big I don't know. The guidance is really, in both cases, the guidance is an update of prior Department of Labor regulations IRA program. That is, if you have an employee that comes to you, the employer, and asks you to take a portion of their paycheck and put it into an IRA, if that's all you do, you're not operating an employer-sponsored plan, and you're not subject to the greater regulatory burdens of ERISA. That was the old 1975 guidance. And what the Department of Labor was trying to do last year was say, we've had these inquiries from the cities and the states. They'd like to operate these payroll deduction IRAs, but they'd also like to use automatic enrollment. They'd like to have workers that don't have access to a plan to be automatically enrolled with the opportunity to opt out or change their contributions. And just so they were trying to clarify how this might work for the states. So now that one level of guidance has been rescinded, and possibly the state guidance might be rescinded as well, it's an open question whether the states or the cities can go forward under the old guidance or not. And ultimately, it's probably a question that will be resolved by the courts. They are the final decision makers in this case. So you'll just have to stay tuned and see what happens.
Thanks very much for that, John. Do any of our other panelists have anything to add on this question?
So this is Ruth, and yes, John described that very well. So many of the states are going to actually sort of turn to the initial guidance because employers that offer IRAs are not covered by ERISA. And we will go forward and undoubtedly be sued, but we think this is such a vital new program. And frankly, the states really need to be acting on how are we going to help people retire, because if we don't act, then states will be having to pay at the back end with greater demand for public services. So we're all planning on moving forward and expect to be sued.
Okay, well, I believe that's all we have time for by way of questions. So this brings us to the conclusion of the webinar. If you have questions following the event, next slide, please, feel free to contact my colleague Jessica Hathaway at NCSL. Her contact information is listed on the screen. As a reminder, the information highlighted today, along with additional resources, is available through both the NCSL and Pew websites. Thank you very much for your interest and participation today. This concludes the webinar.